Innovation, it's something we all aspire to. It's all something our organizations need, and yet perhaps in some ways it feels harder than ever to create it. Today, we're going to talk about something called decision sprints as a way to help us get through the unknown and into innovation and ultimately to action. That's where we're headed today. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. I'm so glad that you're here. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have been here live because this was recorded live with not a studio, but with an audience. And if you want to join for us for those, then you can get this information sooner so you can start to apply it sooner and have your questions make it a better conversation. You can get the information about when we're doing those and who we're doing those with by going to either our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. You can join those by going to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. All of these are live on those two platforms as well as YouTube and Twitter. Who knows? Maybe other social platforms in the future. Who knows? Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteambook.com. That's longdistanceteambook.com, where you can learn more, get access to a sample excerpt of the book, and find out where you can buy your copy. So with that, let me bring in our guest. He's right here. And let me do one more thing, and then we will dive in. Let me introduce him for you. His name is Atif Rafiq, and he has blazed trails in Silicon Valley and the Fortune 500 for over 25 years, though he doesn't look old enough to have made that be true. After rising through organizations like Amazon, Yahoo, and AOL, probably not in that order, he held C-suite roles at McDonald's, Volvo, and MGM Resorts. He was the first Chief Digital Officer in the history of the Fortune 500, pioneering a role he held at McDonald's and then rose to the president level in the Fortune 300. He currently sits on the boards of organizations including Flutter/FanDuel, Clearcover, and KINS Capital. He is passionate about helping leaders move into the future. He accomplishes this through his new software app, Ritual, which is revolutionizing how teams can innovate in problem solving, and solve problems. He's a keynote speaker, and he's also the author of a brand new book, Decision Sprint, the new way to innovate into the unknown and move from strategy to action. And it is with that I should say hello to him and welcome him. Thank you for being here.
Kevin, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to join you.
And here's what we know. One person was listening to me, and he's in Istanbul. So we're not all in Indianapolis or Chicago like Atif and I are. So let's just start with this. We learned a little bit about your background, but tell us about the journey that leads you to this place. Because you didn't wake up when you were 6 and say, I'm going to be a digital expert in helping people innovate. Like that just doesn't happen. You wanted to be a fireman or like an astronaut, right? So tell us a little bit about the journey that gets you here.
Well, it was definitely a baseball player, and obviously that didn't
Okay,
happen.
sorry. I picked.
But yeah, you get the idea. I mean, you stumble upon things in your life, and a lot of things you create out of necessity. So some things you do out of passion and others out of necessity. My passion has been technology, and I thought I'd stay in Silicon Valley for my entire career. But I metamorphosized in about 10 years ago. And 10 years ago matters because it's when Mark Andreessen coined the phrase software is eating the world. And that's where virtually every company in every industry started to look at technology as a very disruptive thing. And they needed to reimagine either their customer experience or their business model, using technology. So McDonald's became the first company that said, we want to create a role called Chief Digital Officer. And at the time I was at Amazon, I couldn't imagine working at McDonald's, and quite frankly, how I would be relevant to them. But, it clicked, the light bulbs went off, and I made that metamorphosis into a very different kind of company because, of course, in Silicon Valley, it's about ideas and creativity. And in a company that's been around a long time, 60 years in the case of McDonald's, 100 years in the case of Volvo, it's more about doing what you did before a little bit better. So it's less about new ideas all the time, of course. So what I'm trying to say is that I was riding a cultural fault line because I was kind of the guinea pig trying to get the elephants to dance. And so I had to create and look for ways to have these organizations be more open to new ideas and to innovate, because only the new things we would do for customers would create the growth we needed, which is what we were responsible for at the top of these companies.
Yeah. So like you're at McDonald's, like how do I translate? Let me see if I can remember these right. Quality, value, service, and cleanliness into digital, right? Like what does that even mean, right?
That's a great question. See, I really tried to speak in familiar terms, and so as opposed to talking about digitization, I spoke about convenience, and convenience as something that we've owned for 60 years because the company invented the drive-through. So when I came to the board within 45 days of joining the company, I said, I positioned it as McDonald's is about three things: taste, value, and convenience. I don't, I'm not responsible for the first two, but the third one, that's where we can really get ahead of things and really lead and reimagine what that looks like. And we should, because we're number one in the industry. So that opened the aperture to like, okay, well, what does this mean in
What does that really
practice? And then
mean?
we were able
Right.
to create new customer experiences around that.
And we're not here to talk about just that. And you've certainly done many things other than that. But all of us, if you're sitting here, and even if you're in Istanbul or London, you probably know McDonald's. And like, yeah, you've got some sense about what some of those things look like today. A number of years later, obviously, Atif. But let's get into sort of the book, if you will. And there's a word in the middle of the subtitle that that you really talk a lot about early, and I think we have to start there. And it's this word. The word is unknown. So let's start with this. Like, how do we, as organizations, as leaders, deal with the unknown in productive sorts of ways? Why is that where you started here, and why is that important to us?
Well, it's a conundrum for most organizations because, on the one hand, growth will come from getting into new territory, implementing new ideas. But by definition, new ideas come with more questions than answers. The unknowns will always outnumber the knowns because it's new territory and unfamiliar. And the reaction to these unknowns really determines whether or not we can get to the other side of distilling a big idea into something actionable, or whether things get stuck or watered down, right? And we don't want those second two things to happen. And the reactions that you typically find to unknowns are either fear or being a little bit too cavalier about these unknowns. And so let's walk through each. If the reaction is fear, then what tends to happen is a really quick rush to judgment where we water down the idea because we say, okay, well, what do we actually know today? And let's build a plan around that. And that tends to be incremental. And so that's a problem. And you typically find that in a large company that's been around a long time. The other way is a little bit more, well, let's just get started. Let's start
Damn the
prototyping.
torpedoes. Let's go, right?
Let's go. And that is more blank check experimentation. And you find that more in tech companies, but we're in an era of austerity. So whether you're Google or Netflix, that era ended about a year ago, where all the CEOs are saying we need more purposeful innovation. So what do we do then? That's where I sort of centered everything around the unknowns. How do we make the unknowns actionable? Because it's the problem is not that they're unknowns, is that a month from now, we want to be a whole lot smarter about these unknowns to kind of see a clear picture of what we should actually be doing. Is the idea good or not? How specifically will the idea come to life? So making unknowns actionable is where I put my focus in this book.
And that is exactly what you do in the book. And so in the very beginning of the book, you talk about where you've drawn inspiration for some of the stuff, and two of the books that you mentioned are books that I'm very familiar with and I agree with. And you sort of make a point that I think is useful, and that is that while the unknowns have always been around, and all of what you just described is not new territory for how we choose to deal with unknowns, but that the world is different now than it used to be as it relates to all that. So why is that? Why is this maybe different than ever, more different than ever, and maybe more important than ever?
Well, I think there's a few things going on. One is the rise of teams, and I know you've written a book about teams, and that is really sort of a realization in companies that it's not about top-down, management deciding everything. You have to enable and empower teams. So that's sort of onset here this last 10 years. So how do you get teams problem solving together is a thing. I think, secondly, innovation has become more important for most organizations because the obvious things have sort of run out. And most companies are valued based on their growth, profitable growth, obviously. And that, by definition, means they need to keep pushing the envelope and inventing new things, in their core and adjacencies. So innovation is just much more essential. And so when you take those two things where you need to constantly ship new things across your organization, and these problems cannot be solved by one function or one lone genius, right? It takes teams. Then how do you enable these teams to innovate in a way where the company can still, feel confident that it's going to lead to something concrete and help the company hit its objectives? So a lot of stuff has been percolating the last 10 years. Now you add austerity in terms of the state of the economy, and it's not so easy
More
to get
unknowns, right?
more,
More unknowns
more,
there.
more unknowns, and the bar for innovation is higher. So they're saying, okay, if we're going to support this idea, you're going to get the buy-in, the green light, right? If the bar was at a certain point a year ago, it's even higher now. And so you really want a more a confident way to put your recommendations on the table, the conclusions you're drawing, the buy-in you're trying to get. You need more. You need to tighten that up, and I think this is a way to help that.
So we were talking with Atif uh, Rafiq, and he's written this book called Decision Sprint. So we probably shouldn't go any further without asking that question. What the heck is a decision sprint?
Decision sprint will help you get from idea to recommendations and decision points. So in order to describe decision sprint, I need to take a step back and introduce an idea introduced in the book, which is upstream work. So I think people will relate to this where,
See, that's where I was going next. So let's
yeah.
do that, and then we'll go back. So what do you mean by upstream work?
Well, I think, in if you have a new idea or there's a new initiative, everyone understands the downstream part, which is where there's an execution plan. So everyone wants to know, well, what's the plan to execute this idea? But at the same time, teams spend weeks, if not months, on what I call upstream work, which is how they navigate, the key questions, kind of identify the unknowns, do detective work to get to the bottom of them, draw conclusions, try and get alignment from stakeholders. Based on that alignment, say, okay, well, this is what we need to decide. And then after decisions are made, only after decisions are made, are they ready to move on to create their execution plan. So it's the step from the raw idea to getting to a decision point and beginning to move on to plan your execution. So that is upstream work, and it takes a lot of energy and time and brain power in companies, and it tends to be unstructured. So what I offer to address upstream work, with a methodology that is, transparent to everybody, whether you're a team member or a sponsor, and also to kind of speed things up, is decision sprint. It helps you get from the raw idea stage where you could get stuck because there's a lot of unknowns and questions to the point where you can make confident decisions.
So one of the things that crossed my mind as I was reading, and as it crosses my mind even maybe a little bit more now that you're talking about this, is that, and so I'm going to make a statement and you can agree, disagree, whatever. So, especially in larger organizations, although I think it's true, as long as we've got one group kind of doing the upstream work, which is at least partially different from who's going to do the downstream or the execution work. Here's the statement. All of that brain power, all of that work that's gone in, all of that thinking that's gone into the upstream work has led all of those people to being in. They're bought in, they're on board, they're ready to go. And then one of the big issues in organizations is, Uh, but everyone else, when we get into execution, hasn't had all that, doesn't know all that. And like that gets in the way. And I know we're going to talk more about it, but I just like, because some people that are listening are already thinking that, okay, that's awesome, but not everyone's in that loop. And so we've got this big lag between the people that are already believers and the people that are like, this is brand new to me. And I don't know anything about what you're talking about. And I've still got all those unknowns in my head.
What you're talking about is such a huge problem in companies, and the way I look at it is we need to take a very different approach. So, what I am suggesting is a way to be inclusive around innovation without slowing down. So, the inclusivity piece really does matter because the participation and the input of the people you're talking about. Let's just say you have a company, and the structure is you have the core, and then you have an innovation team. Now, we've all seen situations where the innovation team has bright ideas, can get a concept up and running, and then all of a sudden hits the brick wall because the core is not supported. That's the case we're talking about. Well, the reason for that is because there are important inputs from the core that were not factored into how people thought about the concept or taking the idea forward. The reason
Even maybe
why
making the idea better. Oh, by the way, not just getting acceptance and understanding, but making it better. Go ahead.
Well, it's definitely about making it better because it's basically missing considerations or new unknowns that should have been, it's unknowns that we could have factored into how they matured the idea. Now, the innovation teams, obviously there's the human factors where, you don't want to get drowned out by all the skepticism, so you try and keep a little space. So the way I approach this is try to hit that sweet spot where you involve people in a neutral, objective way at what I call the exploration stage. And in the exploration stage, you actually spend time inviting and collecting key questions that we need to get to the bottom to. What this does is it turns skepticism on its head because it turns it moves from questioning the idea to providing questions that need to be part of the exploration. So it provides a path to input so people are not surprised later. It actually allows us to get in the collective intelligence of the organization because we have the core of the business for some reason. It's an important contributor, but at the same time, it's not meant to slow things down or to kill the idea because we're making the questions actionable. And so what happens as a
So how
result of that?
so time out. So
Yep.
give us an example. Like intellectually we get that. Make the questions actionable. But give us an example of what that looks like.
Sure. I mean, let's say your Volvo, it's 5 years ago, sustainability is your core pillar. And in addition to making EVs, you think about other things that can make cars sustainable. And one of the ideas is vegan leather. Is it a good idea? Let's get rid of cow leather. Cows have a lot of emissions. Um, is vegan leather a good idea? Well, if we came into a room and that was a brand new idea, two people will say, this is amazing, this is great. And two people will say, this is the worst idea ever. It's not going to work. Um, and the answer is, who knows, right? But the point is, well, what are the key considerations, matters, and questions? So, for example, well, is it something? How is it? How is the perception by customers? Is it like still a premium if it's vegan leather versus cow leather? Um, can you validate that something's really vegan, right? Can it be traced? Is there enough supply
Is that
to
important to this trace? Like we can right. But now we're talking about this sort of the decision criteria rather than looking at the idea itself. And that's really what you're talking about, right?
going all the way to the upstream point of the questions? Because you even sort of don't even need to think of it and frame it as a decision. Questions are very democratic, they're not really contentious, like everyone can contribute. You kind of unload the judgment from the thing and the pressure and the stakes. So, and if you create a space to source questions, to get to the bottom of these questions, and to develop a high base quality fact base or base of information to then draw conclusions. It sounds good in theory, but what happens is we often don't create the space for that. So we rush ahead to alignment and judgment before we've actually done exploration. That's why the first stage of decision sprint is exploration. And I share how to build and run an exploration
Yeah.
so that we can actually draw conclusions based on a lot being much better informed.
So we've started to get here, and obviously, if you go out and get your copy of Decision Sprint, which I would hope that you would do, there's a lot more that we can't talk about, we won't get to here, and yet, what are some of Atif? What are some of the key pieces or components of a decision sprint? We started to go there, but let's go there a little bit more.
Well, I think starting with a problem statement is key. I mean, if there's a different interpretation of what we're trying to solve for, then it's going to lead to a problem because we'll realize that probably late in the game, and then you'll have fits and starts in the project. So let's just make it up. Let's say you're Netflix, there's an issue with password sharing. If
Let's make it up, right? Like there.
Well, it is a real issue,
I know it is. I know it is. That's why I'm joking with you.
Decree from the CEO, right? But if someone takes that problem statement as well, crack down on problem password sharing, that is very different than saying, what is this the balance between the commercial interests that we have and being fair to users around their privacy and their needs to share their account, right? So what I'm saying is starting with a problem statement is really the first step in this process, and I show how to do that, how to approach a fork in the road and craft a problem statement. Now, once you have a problem statement, the very next thing to do is to create a space, and it only takes a couple of days to allow people to suggest questions that need to be part of exploring this problem
Of the exploration. Yep.
And so sourcing questions is something that is much better to do in a dedicated way, rather than having these questions come up in a very unstructured way over weeks and months, where you then have to rework a lot of your ideas and the conclusions and your recommendations. So sourcing questions.
So when you think about I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying. So yeah, sourcing questions, and then think of that as getting to first base. If when I was an executive in well-known companies, if a team told me, we're kicking off the initiative and we need a week, and we're going to come back to you, and we're going to put on the table an awesome question list, all the things we need to get to the bottom of, I would say that's a great use of time.
So when you say create space, are you talking about a platform for that, something that's virtual? Are you talking about space like we're going to get together face to face? Is it a yes and? Like, what do you mean?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm referring to workflow. So when I mean workflow, I say, rather than leaving it to chance of, oh, there's a meeting, some deep dive, some brainstorm, and hopefully you cover the right things, it's actually a purposeful interaction or meeting. Now, some of these things don't need to be meetings. You can do them asynchronously, and I'll talk about that in a second. But when I talk about creating space, I'm talking about specific steps and a sequence of steps. So you have a problem statement, then you actually give people through, a couple of days to suggest questions. They can do that, asynchronously. It doesn't have to be a meeting. It could be a meeting, but you're actually looking to get to a milestone where you have a great question list as a step in the process before you go too far ahead of things. And
I
so
think
it's really
that
about workflow.
if you're listening or watching, that then I think you already get the sense of this, that one of the things Atif is bringing to the table is he's calling workflows. You might think of as a process, but like a standard way we're going to do some of this stuff. Right. And so that's what I love about this book. You might think, well, this is a book by a guy who's been in the C-suite. He's been like at the top levels of big organizations, and this is going to be sort of ethereal. This book is, and the ideas that we've been talking about for the last 25 minutes are very much about like, here's how to do it, and here are the steps that we can take. So again, you and I could have a very long conversation, and I know that I would enjoy it greatly. But in the time that we have left, what else do you want to say about workflows specifically?
Well, I think workflows define culture. And so to me, and I write about this in the book, where everybody wants a progressive, innovative culture. Unfortunately, slogans do not cut it. So I always measure culture by workflow. The reason I say that, Kevin, is because it's the day-to-day experience of the employee that determines culture, not the slogans. So what are these people facing? In the case we talked about earlier, where maybe there's silos, there's that defines culture. If there's a kind of a hesitancy to collaborate, or not lack of a know-how on how to collaborate, that defines something about the culture. If we go down to the way I look to solve that is offering a workflow that kind of helps us avoid some of this, because when the workflow says, we are purposeful around our innovation, it's not blank check innovation, and we're not going to say yes to everything, but we're open to creating space for ideas to be explored. This is how we do it, and then the merits of the idea will speak for themselves. That is a good workflow. If you can have that kind of workflow in your organization, that's going to elicit the right culture. And so workflows are really important to me, and they form the basis of what I'm really trying to shoot for, which is an operating system for management and how we run companies. That's really what I hope to establish, over the coming years. And the book is kind of one part of it.
Operating system for how we lead our organizations. That's a pretty good way to think about it. And you would, all of you, we'll put this in the show notes. But for Atif, you'll appreciate the post that I wrote for our blog earlier this particular week as we're live, which is that I think the title is "Meetings Are a Window into Our Culture." Like if culture is the way we do things around here, which is what I think it is, which is not a slogan, and it's not something stated from the top that this is our culture, then the workflows, the processes, the way we collaborate, the way we do the work is in fact the culture itself. So it's another one of the things, and as you can see, I already had this ready for this conversation, and you led us right into it. So when I started this podcast, and we're I don't know 380 some episodes in, Atif, I said that I'm going to have people on here that are leadership experts and expert leaders. And I think sometimes the best episodes are when they're both, right? And you've certainly done the work, and you are now helping others do the work. So you fit both, you wear both of those hats. And yet there are people that are listening or watching who are saying, okay, I love this, but I'm not in the C-suite. Right? I'm a mid-level leader. I'm a front-level leader. I'm even in a smaller organization. What advice do you have for like all of us? Like what's one or two things that you would encourage us to do? Maybe where we would start with some of the ideas, other than, of course, getting a copy of the book, decisionsprint.com. Other than that, like what would you say to us?
Well, I believe that change can start at the team level. And here's why I believe that. So, specifically, let's say you're a project lead on an initiative, or you're a key member of an initiative. In most companies, the way it works is that, you form the team, they have some time to get their thoughts together, and they have different, check ins with sponsors where they're previewing their work, or they're putting recommendations on the table, or they're saying, oh, like, we need to decide something, we're having a decision meeting, right? But in between those interactions, your company is not standardizing generally, like how you're going about, getting to the bottom of things and coming up with your plans and your suggestions, right? And so you can embrace a decision sprint specifically for one initiative as kind of your engine to power recommendations, decisions, and creating alignment in your organization. So I'd recommend trying to implement these ideas just specifically around one initiative. And the reason why I think that's powerful is because I know from being on the more on the executive side that you are able to compare the work of teams. So an executive might say, why was this initiative, it was so much easier and streamlined to understand, to have clarity, to move things along, to make the connection between what they're asking me to decide and how they got there, right? That breadcrumb. And I want more of my teams to work this way, and so what's your secret sauce? And so then you can then socialize. Well, we have a workflow, we have a method to our madness, and here's what it is. And that's how you can help change your company. So you can work and change sort of team level up, um, with Decision Sprint. Now, I also have created a software company called Ritual, which is a team level product. It can be downloaded and you can just sort of begin to run your initiative through the exploration, the way we help you build and run explorations and get meeting ready content coming out of that. So, that's another option, but it's not a requirement. I mean, you can take the ideas that I'm offering and just organize your meetings very differently. And I walk through specifically how to do that. And I think that's how you can begin to affect change, be a spark in your organization.
So let's just stay there for a second. Ritual.ai. So, okay, it's software, and then we get that. But there's the AI piece, which, you go back to the beginning of our conversation, talk about innovation. Like that's those two letters and what that all means, and what maybe some people don't even really understand yet what they mean, or are still trying to figure out what they mean to their organization. Like, what's the AI piece of this tool, Ritual.ai?
Well, it's very exciting, quite frankly. So one thing we do right now with Ritual using AI is help you generate a problem statement, because it's kind of hard, right? Like you got handed the leadership of a key initiative, and you had to define the problem statement. It may not be obvious, so we use AI to help you do that. So for example, we ask you, hey, what makes it hard to address this challenge or meet this objective, and then we kind of use AI to help generate a problem statement. That's one area. In the future, what we're doing is, you can suggest questions, but based on the raw questions you're providing, AI helps suggest other questions that might be part of your exploration. And so AI can help speed things up, for humans, and that's how kind of we look at it. And I really think the velocity of innovation is about to just crescendo here in the next few years, because workflow plus AI is going to be very powerful. Like Decision Sprint is essentially a workflow for that, and then AI just sort of speeds it up. You put that together with the right talent in an organization, and the companies that get that right, it's going to be a huge advantage for them.
I love that. I just wrote this down. Workflow plus AI plus talent equals an up arrow. That's what I just wrote down in my own personal notes. I wrote it straight up. I didn't even make it up and to the right. I just went straight up. So I want to shift gears a little bit, if I may, and ask you this: like, what do you do for fun?
Oh, for fun, well, I do yoga and I love that. I take walks. I love sports, so I attend a lot of sporting events, professional sports teams. I'm here in Chicago, but I drive up to see the Milwaukee Bucks. They've got a pretty great team up there. So
They have a pretty good team with a pretty
yeah.
good player. I was just going to ask, if you're in Chicago and you're a baseball guy, White Sox or Cubs?
Well, I'm originally from New York, so I'm a huge Yankees fan, and I go down to spring training, most years. And when the Yankees come to town, I go see them. So I'm neutral on that subject. Thankfully, there's pros and cons. Cubs have great history. White Sox have a nice ballpark. It's all good.
Okay, cool. So, one of the things in my entire life, when I've walked into people's offices and I see books, the first thing I'm doing, almost maybe not to my detriment, is looking to see what they've read and
Yeah.
what I've already read. And in later years, do they have any of my books on their shelf? But um, and so longtime listeners know that I always ask this question, and I as a young person, I started asking smart people this question. And so I made it a habit to do it here on the show. And the question is, Atif, what are you reading now? Or what's something you've read recently?
Well, I'm in the middle of a book called Happy at Any Cost. And your audience may have heard about it because it's about Tony Hsieh, the late founder of Zappos, who passed away. And I'm still in the middle of it. So I don't fully understand everything I need to understand. But the reason I think this is an important work is because it's emphasizing the mental health piece of, let's say, success. And I think, it's important for all of us, but especially for people who are earlier in their career, to have the right perspective on success, because I think often we're taught the wrong things about success. I mean, there's a gazillion books that are going to teach you how to be successful or make a lot of money, right? And what we don't talk about is the dark side of some of the quote unquote success, which really is there. So, for example, entrepreneurs are taught, um, you know, focus so much on building your successful unicorn where you don't pay your credit card bills, your credit score tanks, your family never hears from you, your health suffers, and be so laser focused on creating this unicorn. That is really wrong. And
Let's just be clear. There are better choices than that, right?
well, how do we, I still want you to create your unicorn, but I don't want you to lose your relationships or your health.
Yeah.
And I think so there's opportunity now for us to think differently about success. And so that's one reason I'm reading the book.
Happy at any cost. So now the question you wanted me to ask most from the very beginning, like where can we learn more? We've already talked about they can go to decisionsprint.com. They can learn more about the software tool by going to ritual.ai. Is there anything else that you want to say before we go about where do you want to point people? I'll hold up the book if people are watching.
Oh, thanks so much, Kevin. Well, you can always reach me on LinkedIn. I do respond to mails I get there. And on LinkedIn, I have a newsletter. It's called Rewire. It's one of LinkedIn's top 50 newsletters. So if you punch in Rewire and my name, my first name or my last name, you'll find it. And would love to have people subscribe so they can hear more ideas around. I tend to talk about progressive management techniques, right? Things that are not only about new ways to innovate, but more progressive ways to lead people and create better culture.
And everyone, I have not seen the first issue, but I have subscribed myself. So I hope that you'll join both of us there. So now, before we go, I have a question for all of you. And many of you know, if you've watched before or listened before, you know this question. The question is, now what? What action are you going to take as a result of this? Maybe it's something that we talked about. Maybe it's something specifically that Atif said. Maybe it's thinking more carefully about upstream work. Maybe it's thinking about how you do exploration differently or even do exploration. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's thinking about how we include more people in the process without slowing down. And you've got some ideas about how you can do that. Maybe it's about asking more questions in a different vein so that you can really create, you can lower the stakes and lower the judgment related to that so that we can really get the information we need. It could be anything. But the question is, if you don't take some action, the point is, if you don't take some action on what we've just done, there was probably better entertainment than this. But if you're here because you want to get better, you want to make a bigger difference for your team, for your organization, for the world, then you gotta have to act. And so my challenge to you, as always, is what action will you take as a result of being here? And if you do that, this will be of far more value to you. Atif, thank you so much for joining me. It was such a pleasure to have you.
The pleasure was all mine, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
So everybody, if you liked this, come back. And if you like this, tell someone else. And wherever you listen to this, there's a way to refer it and rate it. And so do those things and make sure you come back for next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.